There is a specific kind of silence that falls over the Wisconsin River Valley just before a summer storm. A heavy, static stillness where the air grows thick enough to choke on and the light turns a bruised, sickly purple. It is a landscape of ancient geology, of rolling hills carved by glaciers and rivers that have snaked through the limestone for millennia. A place that feels eternal, indifferent to the petty dramas of the human species. But on a sweltering afternoon in August 1914, that indifference was shattered. If you were standing on the ridge overlooking the valley that day, you would not have seen a storm of rain and thunder, but a storm of human making. You would have seen a column of black, oily smoke rising like a dark finger accusing the heavens. A signal fire announcing that the utopia on the hill had fallen. This was not merely a house fire. It was the physical manifestation of a nightmare, the moment when the most sophisticated artistic vision in American history collided with the most primal, savage impulse of the human animal. We often speak of architecture as a shelter, a way to organize the chaos of the natural world into straight lines, reliable roofs, and warm hearths. We build walls to keep the wind out, to keep the cold out, and, perhaps subconsciously, to keep the darkness of the world at bay. Frank Lloyd Wright, the greatest architect America has ever produced, believed he could do more than that. He believed he could build a house that was a moral fortress, a structure so perfectly integrated with the earth, so harmoniously aligned with the principles of truth and beauty, that it would protect the soul of the man living inside it. He was wrong. The tragedy of Taliesin is not just a story of murder, it is a story of hubris. It is the story of a man who thought he could rewrite the rules of society and the laws of God, only to find that the fates are jealous, and they do not like to be ignored. When we look back at the black and white photographs of the estate, with its low-pitched roofs hugging the brow of the hill, we see a masterpiece of the prairie style. But if you look closer, if you strip away the mythology and the celebrity, you can almost smell the gasoline. You can almost hear the screaming that echoed off those limestone walls. A cacophony of terror that abruptly silenced the music of the future. This is the autopsy of an American dream that bled out on the floor of a dining room, a narrative so dark and so complex that it forces us to question the price of genius and the fragility of the sanctuary we call home. To truly understand the horror of 1914, we cannot start with the fire. We must start with the scandal that ignited the fuse years earlier. We must go back to the stifling, corseted world of Oak Park, Illinois, in the first decade of the 20th century. Frank Lloyd Wright was already a legend, a man who strode through the streets with a cape and a cane, a peacock in a world of pigeons. He had redefined the American home, breaking open the Victorian boxes and letting the space flow freely. But inside his own life, he was suffocating. He was trapped in a marriage to Catherine Tobin that had grown cold and perfunctory. Burdened by the responsibilities of 6 children and the crushing weight of upper-middle-class respectability, Wright was a man of voracious appetites for beauty, for luxury, for adoration, and Oak Park was too small a stage for his ego. And then, there was Mama Borthwick Cheney. To history, she is often reduced to a footnote, the mistress, the catalyst. This is a grave injustice. Mama was a force of nature in her own right. She was not a wide-eyed ingenue seduced by the great artist. She was a brilliant intellectual, a feminist, a librarian, and a translator of the radical Swedish philosopher Ellen Key. She was a woman who believed in the free love movement before there was a name for it, who believed that the spiritual connection between a man and a woman transcended the legal contracts of marriage. She was married to Edwin Cheney, a mild-mannered electrical engineer for whom Wright had built a house. It was in that house, amidst the clean lines and the warm wood that Wright had designed, that the architect and the client's wife fell into a love so consuming it threatened to burn down their entire world. The connection was electric and immediate. They were intellectual soulmates, to modern minds trapped in an antiquated century. They spoke a language that no one else in Oak Park understood, a language of art, philosophy, and liberation. But in 1909, you did not simply leave your spouse. You certainly did not leave your children. To do so was social suicide. It was a moral crime akin to treason. Yet Wright and Mama did not care. Driven by a passion that bordered on madness, they made a decision that would shock the nation. They abandoned everything. Wright left his wife and 6 children. Mama left her husband and 2 children, John and Martha. They fled to Europe, running away to Berlin, and then to the sun-drenched hills of Fiesole, Italy. For a year, they lived in a bubble of bliss, wandering through museums, walking the ancient streets, convincing themselves that they were pioneers of a new morality. Wright worked on his famous Wasmuth portfolio, which would introduce his work to Europe and change the course of modern architecture, while Mama worked on her translations. They were Adam and Eve in a new garden, believing they had escaped the judgment of the serpent. But the world was watching. The Chicago newspapers were ruthless. The headlines were vitriolic, painting Wright as a mad genius and Mama as a vampire, a homewrecker who had abandoned her maternal duties for lust. The vitriol was relentless. They were not just celebrities, they were pariahs. They were hated. When they returned to the United States in 1911, they knew there was no place for them in polite society. They could not return to the manicured lawns of Oak Park. They needed a fortress. Wright turned his eyes to the land of his ancestors, the Lloyd-Joneses, a clan of fiery Welsh preachers and farmers who had settled in the valley of the Wisconsin River near Spring Green. This was the landscape of his childhood, a place of rolling hills and mist-covered valleys that he held in his heart as sacred. Here, on a hill that his family had always loved, he would build his sanctuary. He named it Taliesin, Welsh for shining brow, because the house did not sit on the hill, but of the hill, wrapping around its side like a natural outcropping of stone. If you enjoy these deep dives into the psychology of history and the hidden corners of the past, where biography meets true crime, I would invite you to subscribe to the channel right now. We are dedicated to unearthing the stories that textbooks are too afraid to tell, and your support allows us to keep digging into the archives of the macabre. Taliesin was not just a house, it was a manifesto of defiance. Wright poured everything he had into its money, his reputation, his soul. He used local yellow limestone, quarried from the nearby hills, laying the stones in strata that mimicked the natural rock formations. He used sand from the river for the plaster, making the walls shimmer with the color of the riverbanks. The design was labyrinthine, a complex of courtyards, studios, living quarters, and gardens, all interconnected, all flowing into one another. It was designed to be self-sufficient, a world unto itself where he and Mama could live according to their own rules, protected from the prying eyes of the press and the judgment of the church. For 3 years, from 1911 to 1914, Taliesin was their idol. It was the love cottage, as the cynical press called it, but to Wright and Mama, it was paradise. Mama's children, John and Martha, would visit in the summers, filling the courtyards with the sound of laughter, a tentative attempt to repair the bonds that had been strained by the scandal. Wright's draftsmen worked in the studio, a group of loyal apprentices who believed in the master's vision. They farmed the land, they held musical evenings, they read poetry by the fire. It seemed, for a brief, shining moment, that they had won. They had weathered the storm of public opinion and created a life of beauty and integrity on their own terms. But paradise is fragile, and the serpent had already slithered into the garden, not in the form of a devil, but in the form of a servant. In the summer of 1914, the heat in the valley was oppressive. The corn stood high and dry in the fields, the leaves rustling like dry paper in the hot wind. The air was thick with humidity and tension. Wright and Mama had hired a couple from Barbados to work at the estate, Julian Carlton and his wife, Gertrude. Julian was a man of mystery. He was intelligent, literate, and capable, serving as a handyman and butler, while Gertrude worked as the cook. But there was something off about Julian. The draftsman later recalled a strange intensity in his eyes, a brooding silence that would descend upon him without warning. He was a man out of place, a black man in a fiercely white rural community, isolated and perhaps subjected to the casual, corrosive racism of the era. The atmosphere in the house began to curdle in the weeks leading up to August. There were disputes. Carlton had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that the other workers were mocking him, that he was being watched. He was insubordinate, clashing with the draftsman, and even with Wright himself. The tension grew so thick that Wright and Mama decided to let the couple go. They gave Julian and Gertrude their notice. Their last day was to be August 15th. It was a mundane administrative decision, the firing of a difficult employee. They had no idea that they had just signed a death warrant. The mind of Julian Carlton is a black box that history has never fully been able to pry open. Was it a sudden psychotic break? Was it a calculated revenge for perceived slights? Was it the heat, the isolation, the pressure of working for an imperious genius like Wright? We will never know for sure, but we know that in the silence of his room, Julian Carlton was not packing his bags. He was sharpening a hatchet. The morning of Saturday, August 15, 1914, dawned clear and hot. Frank Lloyd Wright was not at Taliesin. He had taken the train to Chicago to supervise the final touches on the Midway Gardens project, a massive entertainment complex that was consuming his professional attention. He left Mama in charge of the estate. It was a fateful absence, a twist of destiny that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If he had been there, would things have been different? Or would his body simply have been added to the pile? At noon, the estate was quiet. The rhythm of the day was slow and lazy. In the main residential wing, Mama Borthwick sat down for lunch on the porch, a beautiful screened-in space that overlooked the rolling hills of the valley. She was joined by her two children, 11-year-old John and 8-year-old Martha, who were visiting from Chicago. It should have been a moment of perfect domestic peace, a mother and her children sharing a meal in the sanctuary her lover had built for her. In the other wing of the house, in the workman's dining room, the draftsman and laborers Emil Bradell, Herbert Fritz, William Weston, and others were also sitting down to eat. Julian Carlton served them all. He moved with a terrifying calm. He brought soup to Mama and the children. He placed the bowls on the table. He was polite, efficient, the perfect servant. But his heart was pounding with a murderous rhythm. He walked away from the porch, leaving them to eat. He went to the door, and quietly, surreptitiously, he locked the screen door from the outside. He then went to the courtyard. He had prepared containers of gasoline. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to erase. He wanted to unleash a hell that would consume the very idea of Taliesin. Carlton poured the gasoline under the door of the porch and along the outer walls. The fumes must have drifted in, a sharp chemical sting mixing with the smell of the soup, confusing the diners for a split second. Then, he struck a match. The explosion was instantaneous. The dry wood of the porch, seasoned by the summer sun and soaked in fuel, caught fire with a roar that sounded like a bomb. The porch turned into a blast furnace. Inside, panic erupted. Mama and the children screamed, jumping from their chairs, their clothes catching the heat, the air suddenly turning into fire. Their instinct was to run, to escape the inferno. They threw themselves at the door, but it was locked. They smashed through the screens, stumbling out into the courtyard, gasping for air, their hair singed, their minds unable to process the violence of the moment. But Julian Carlton was waiting. This is the part of the story that forces us to stare into the abyss. It is not enough that he set them on fire. He needed to be the hand of death itself. As Mama Borthwick stumbled through the broken screen, blinded by smoke and terror, Carlton stepped forward. He did not hesitate. He swung the hatchet with brutal, sickening force. He struck Mama down where she stood. The woman who had defied the world for love, the intellectual powerhouse, the mother, ended her life in the dust of the courtyard, murdered by the man who had just served her lunch. He did not stop. John, the 11-year-old boy, scrambled out next. Carlton struck him. Then little Martha. The brutality is incomprehensible. He slaughtered the family one by one as they fled the fire. There was no mercy, no hesitation, only a rhythmic, mechanical violence. Meanwhile, the fire had spread to the other wing. The draftsmen in the dining room realized too late that this was not an accident. They smelled the smoke, saw the flames licking at the windows. They tried to escape, but Carlton had targeted them too. He had poured gasoline there as well. As the men jumped from the windows, clothes smoking, coughing up soot, Carlton was there. He ran around the building like a demon, attacking anyone who emerged from the smoke. He struck Emil Bradell, the young draftsman. He struck the gardener, David Lindblom. He struck the handyman, Thomas Brunker. It was a scene of total pandemonium. The crackling of the timber, the roar of the flames, the screams of the dying men. Herbert Fritz, one of the draftsmen, managed to jump out of a window and roll down the hill to extinguish his burning clothes, breaking his arm in the process. He survived to tell the tale. William Weston, the carpenter, was struck by the hatchet, but, filled with adrenaline, managed to grapple with Carlton briefly before escaping, running to a neighboring farm to raise the alarm. Within minutes, the residential wing of Taliesin was a roaring pyre. The roof collapsed. The stone walls turned black, and amidst the inferno lay 7 bodies: Mama Borthwick, John Cheney, Martha Cheney, Emil Brodell, Thomas Brunker, David Lindblom, Ernest Weston, the 13-year-old son of the carpenter. 7 lives extinguished in a spasm of violence that lasted less than 10 minutes. Carlton, his work done, did not try to flee the county. He didn't run into the woods. He ran to the basement of the unburned studio wing. There, in the darkness, he swallowed a vial of muriatic acid, a corrosive chemical used for cleaning masonry. He intended to die with his victims, to burn himself from the inside, just as he had burned them from the outside. But the acid didn't kill him immediately. It burned his throat and esophagus, leaving him in agony, but alive. He crawled into the furnace, closing the door behind him, waiting for the end. The neighbors, alerted by the smoke and the frantic arrival of William Weston, rushed to the scene. They found a slaughterhouse. The fire was so intense they could not get near the bodies at first. They formed a bucket brigade, trying desperately to save the studio where Wright's drawings were kept, but the living quarters were gone. When the fire subsided enough, they pulled the bodies from the wreckage. It is said that the men, hardened farmers who had seen death in nature many times, wept openly at the sight of the children. In Chicago, Frank Lloyd Wright was sitting in the dining room of the Midway Gardens, eating lunch. The telephone rang. It was a message from his cousin. The details were garbled, at first a fire, an accident. But, as the afternoon wore on, the truth began to bleed through the wires. Wright collapsed. The world tilted on its axis. He rushed to the train station, boarding the next locomotive north. I want you to pause for a moment and consider the psychological state of that train ride. Hours of rhythmic clacking on the tracks, moving through the darkening landscape, heading toward the place that was supposed to be his heaven, now transformed into his hell. What do you think goes through a mind in that situation? Is it denial? Is it a bargaining with God? Or is it a cold, heavy realization that the price for his defiance has finally been collected? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that great tragedy is the inevitable shadow of great ambition? When Wright arrived in Spring Green, it was night. The valley was illuminated by the lantern light of the neighbors who were guarding the ruins. The smell was the first thing to hit him: wet ash, roasted meat, gasoline. He walked through the smoldering debris like a ghost. He found Mama's body. She had been burned, but he could still recognize her. The devastation was total. The press, the same vultures that had hounded them in life, descended upon the tragedy in death. They swarmed the valley, hungry for the gore, spinning stories of divine retribution. This is what happens. The subtext of the articles read, "When you break the sanctity of marriage." The local ministers preached sermons about the wages of sin. It was a final, cruel indignity. Wright, in his grief, was stoic and terrifying. He refused to let Mama be taken to a funeral home. He refused a Christian burial. He had a simple wooden box made by the surviving carpenters. He filled it with flowers from the garden they had planted together. Wildflowers, weeds, anything that grew from the soil of Taliesin. He placed her body inside. There was no service, no hymns. He loaded the coffin onto a wagon and drove it himself to the family chapel nearby. He buried her in the ground, unmarked, returning her to the earth and the shadows. They found Julian Carlton in the furnace. He was dragged out, barely alive, unable to speak because of the acid burns. He was taken to the county jail in Dodgeville. The lynch mob formed quickly. The locals wanted to hang him from the nearest tree, but the sheriff managed to keep them at bay. Carlton never stood trial. He starved to death in his cell 7 weeks later, unable to swallow, taking his motives to the grave. He died a mystery, a void of silence that has frustrated historians for a century. For most people, the story would end here. The house is destroyed, the love is dead, the dream is over. A normal man would sell the land, move to a city far away, and try to forget. But Frank Lloyd Wright was not a normal man. His grief did not manifest as retreat, it manifested as a furious, almost manic need to rebuild. He wrote to a friend, "Taliesin must live." It was a defiance of death itself. He began construction on Taliesin to almost immediately. He took the stones that had been blackened by the fire and reused them. He didn't scrub them clean. He wanted the scars to be visible. He built the new house on the footprints of the old one, but he made it larger, more complex. He worked with a feverish intensity, driving his workmen hard. It was as if, by stacking stone upon stone, he could somehow resurrect the life he had lost. But the ghost of Mama haunted every corridor. Wright was a man unmoored. Without her intellectual companionship and her grounding presence, he drifted. He entered into a disastrous relationship with Miriam Noel, a wealthy, unstable woman who had written him a letter of condolence. Noel was addicted to morphine, volatile, and deeply troubled. She moved into Taliesin too, and the house became a battleground of emotional abuse and chaos. The serenity of the Mama years was gone, replaced by a gothic melodrama. And then, as if the script were written by a cruel playwright, fire struck again. In April 1925, during a fierce thunderstorm, a telephone wire shorted out. The spark ignited the dry wood of Taliesin too. Once again, the smell of smoke. Once again, the roar of flames. Wright watched helplessly as his second fortress burned to the ground. He lost a lifetime of art collection, priceless Asian sculptures, screens, rare books, and his own drawings. It was a financial and emotional catastrophe. The locals nodded knowingly. "The curse," they said. "God is not done with him." But Wright stood in the smoking ruins, his hair now grey, his face lined with age and bitterness, and he made a vow. "I will build it again," he said, "and I will plant it so deep in the ground that nothing can destroy it." He built Taliesin III. This is the version that stands today. It is a sprawling, complex organism of a building, a testament to sheer bloody-minded persistence. He lived there until his death in 1959. Presiding over the Taliesin Fellowship, a cult-like community of apprentices who worked the fields and drafted his plans. Taliesin III is beautiful, undeniably. But it is a beauty born of trauma. When you walk through its spaces today, you are walking through a graveyard. The layout of the house is confusing, shifting, full of low ceilings that suddenly open up to vast vistas, physical manifestation of Wright's turbulent psyche. The history of the massacre is not advertised on the tour plaques, but it is there. It is in the very soil. It is in the way the wind whistles through the oaks. The story of Taliesin serves as a dark mirror to the American century. It reflects the tension between our puritanical roots and our avant-garde ambitions. It reflects the violence that often lurks beneath the surface of our most pastoral landscapes. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to create an architecture that was organic, that grew from the inside out. In the end, he succeeded, but in a way he never intended. Taliesin grew from his love, yes, but it was watered with blood and fertilized with ash. We revere Wright as a genius, and rightly so. He changed the way we live. He gave us space, light, and flow. But we must never forget the cost. We must never forget Mama Borthwick and her children, the sacrificial lambs on the altar of his ego. Their deaths remind us that art does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a messy, dangerous world where passion can lead to creation, but also to destruction. As the sun sets over spring green today, the shadows stretch long across the yellow limestone. The house is quiet now, a museum piece, frozen in time. But if you listen closely, past the tour guides and the tourists, you might hear the echo of a laugh cut short, or the crackle of a flame that refuses to go out. Taliesin stands as a monument not just to architecture, but to resilience, the terrible, beautiful, necessary resilience of continuing to live when everything you love has burned down. If this descent into the architecture of tragedy has left you wanting to explore more stories where the blueprint of a house becomes a map to madness, you need to continue this marathon. There is another house, built not for love, but for fear. A house built by a woman, convinced that she was being hunted by the spirits of the dead. A labyrinth of stairs that lead nowhere, and doors that open into walls. Click the video on your screen now to enter the Winchester Mystery House and discover what happens when you try to build a cage for ghosts.